Hello everyone, welcome to this Thrive Tribe conversation. I'm Paul Mallory from the Thrive Tribe and I'm delighted to welcome Liggy Webb. Welcome, Liggy.
Hi Paul, it's really lovely to be here with you. I'm looking forward to this chat.
Well, thank you so much for sparing the time. I know you've had a hectic day and you've managed to fit us in as well, so I'm really grateful to you. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, Liggy is an author. She writes these wonderful bite-sized books, which I have a full set of, which are absolutely fantastic. The graphics and everything, loads of colour, fantastic. On behavioural stuff, really, isn't it? And we're going to talk about resilience tonight. She's also done one on mood busters and one on well-being and a whole series of these things, which are fantastic. So you might want to tell us a bit more about those during the course of events, Liggy. But thank you so much for sparing the time. And shall we talk a bit about resilience? It's you and I bumped into each other on a radio show, didn't we, for the BBC, where we were talking about how to survive the pandemic and lockdown and all the rest of it. In the UK, for our overseas viewers, in the UK, we're in our second lockdown at the moment for another week or so. And then there's a rumour that we might be allowed out for Christmas. I feel a bit like a prisoner in a cell block at times. But we were talking on the radio about some of the challenges of being in lockdown and some of the emotional challenges and some of the stress challenges and things. And this subject of resilience came up, Liggy, which I know is a subject you're very expert in, along with all these other behavioural skills. So should we just start talking about resilience? Perhaps you could explain how you see that, what resilience is, and we'll expand out into how that can help people, having that notion.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm really passionate about the topic of resilience. I spent many years researching it, writing about it. So, but before I define what resilience is, I think it's a good idea to be really clear about what resilience isn't, because resilience is not about toughing it out to the detriment of your own well-being. Resilience is a lot about positive recovery. There is something that Winston Churchill once said. He said, if you're going through hell, keep going. And whilst that might be true, it's how you go about doing that. So what I really want to do with the work and the research that I conduct is to help people to understand that the true story of resilience is about how we take a journey of self-discovery, we learn about ourselves, because very often that is, one of the biggest learning experiences that we have around resilience. It's not when we go through easy times, it's actually when we go through the more difficult times.
Yeah.
So it's very much about adapting to that. And one of the best definitions I think that resilience is, it's emotional sunscreen. I think that's a really good definition.
Emotional sunscreen.
Yeah. Because there's lots of things that are going to affect us, but being able to create that filter and to have that coping mechanism, to have that toolkit of resources we can dip into is super helpful.
Oh, okay. So in your analogy there, the sun beating down is the stress and the pressure of what's happening and the things that bother us.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and we can't avoid those. I mean, life isn't perfect. We're going to have all sorts of things that we're going to have to deal with. Currently, we're dealing with this corona coaster of emotions, aren't we? We're all in the same storm, but we're all in different boats. And I think that's, a really good analogy. That, by the way, isn't my original. That came from a poem that was written by a guy called Damien Barr, who wrote, a British writer who wrote all about corona coaster. But I think that's very true, isn't it? Right now, we're all experiencing these unprecedented, difficult times, and we're having to learn how to be able to navigate these stormy waters, really, aren't we?
Yeah, and I think, as you hinted there, some people cope better than others, it would seem, don't they? And maybe some people already have a layer of sunscreen and others haven't found the sunscreen yet.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, something I've really learned about resilience, it's a lifelong lesson. There's no single silver bullet solution. It's something that we're learning about all the time.
Yeah, and that's a good point as well, Lee, that occurred to me before we talked today, that, subjects like this, subjects like resilience and these life skills that we're talking about, they're coming into focus a lot at the moment because of coronavirus and the pandemic and lockdowns and things that are giving people extra challenges. But of course, these are life skills we need anyway, aren't they? I was writing about something yesterday where I was using the example of dealing with grief, for example, when we lose a loved one, as being a really extreme case of, wow, that's tough for anyone to cope with. So although the pandemic sort of causes us to focus on some of these issues, these are great things to know anyway, aren't they, regardless of coronavirus?
Oh gosh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've spent my life working in lots of interesting areas. I've worked as a consultant for the UN for, gosh, about 12 years now. So I've worked in some of the peace missions, the war zones, been doing a lot of work this summer with frontline workers, working with the NHS, and all the different challenges that people experience. And being able to have that toolkit of resources is going to last us for the rest of our lives, because we don't know what's around the corner. Clearly we're dealing with something that is very unusual, it's unprecedented, it's taken us all by surprise, really, hasn't it?
Yes.
But we don't know what's around the corner for the rest of our lives, and if we can have these resources to help us to be able to deal with some of those challenges, then that's going to be really helpful.
Yeah, completely. I completely agree. So resilience, you see that as a skill, do you? It's something that we can learn?
Yes. Yeah, I absolutely believe that. I mean, the brain is neuroplastic. We have this neuroplasticity that allows us to be able to learn all the time and to be able to grow. And I truly believe that as a skill, resilience is something that we can all learn.
Right. And so can we dig a bit deeper into what resilience actually is? It's a sunscreen. But what does it look like? How do you know resilience when you see it? What do resilient people do that less resilient people don't do, for example?
Well, about 10 years ago, I started some research, and about 9 years ago, I actually wrote a book called Resilience: How to Cope When Everything Around You Keeps Changing. And I had the opportunity to do lots of scientific research, but also to go out to identify people from all over the world and to interview them and to identify, okay, what are the skills that people need to make them truly resilient? And there's a whole collection of skills that we need. But if I was going to define this using a 3-pillar model that I've developed, it's first of all, it's about taking personal responsibility. It's about being accountable for everything that happens to us in our lives. It's making choices about how we respond to those situations, because very often we can be quite reactive. So it's about being responsive, stepping back, considering our options, and an understanding that we are empowered with those choices that we make. The second pillar is very much about how we adapt, but in a world that's moving very quickly, it's about agility. So our speed of responsiveness and how we embrace change is really, really important. And the third pillar is absolutely about mindset. We have tens of thousands of thoughts a day. So the quality of those thoughts, that inner narrative, is so important. It's about being optimistic. It's not about negating all the negatives, but it's choosing to be able to focus on the potential solutions and the opportunities through some of those challenges.
Yes, and as you say, dealing with change, which talking of life skills, I mean, that must be one of the things that people are most challenged by in all walks of life, the pace of change, the speed of change. And well, my God, what's changed in the last 2 or 3 years has been 10 times more than has changed for the rest of my adult life. I mean, it seems, when you look back over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been incredible change, hasn't there, really?
And who knows what the next 3 years are going to bring.
Yeah, so. Exactly. Yeah. What else could possibly happen? And it often occurs to me, particularly in my work in business in the past, that a lot of the structural things that are in place and a lot of the expertises that are around are historically based. So many experts tend to be people who know how things have been done for the last 30 years. It's not necessarily very helpful when we get into this turmoil and complete sort of, everything changing all the time. And so that really brings into focus, doesn't it, why we need resilience and a lot of these other skills as well, I think, about self-care and self-love and all those things.
Yeah. And also, we're saying about experts and all the things we know, but I kind of, I struggle a bit with the word expert anyway, because it kind of implies we have nothing left to learn. And the world that we live in, we're constantly learning and we're constantly growing. So having that growth mindset, not being fixed in our thinking, because it comes back to that, if you always do what you've always done, you get the same outcome. And if you want a different outcome, you need to be able to step back and consider some fresh thinking. Being able to let go of things that we've learned because they might not be relevant for the future. So our ability to learn, unlearn, relearn is going to help us definitely in this fourth industrial revolution, because that's a challenging time for us anyway.
Yeah, and another subject, I know you've written a book on, I've yet to read, I've got it over there to read, on critical thinking, for example, which is one of my big pet subjects, the ability of people to examine things and wonder whether they may or may not be true. When in an age where people seem to accept everything they're told, remarkably, to an astonishing degree. So dealing with change and dealing with newness and stuff coming along, and is this true or not true, requires a level of critical thinking maybe that we haven't needed in the past so much.
Yeah, and we hear the term information anxiety used a lot because we've got all of this information being thrown at us. And as you say, some of it's well evidenced, well curated, and some of it isn't. So being able to apply critical thinking skills to distill and to work out, how well evidenced something is, and not take everything on face value, because quite frankly, if we believed everything that was out there, we'd be a nervous wreck, wouldn't we? So, because there's a lot of fake news and there's a lot of rubbish stuff that gets, fabricated, fear mongering. So being able to disseminate between what's good information and useful information and what we can disregard is a core skill.
Just on that subject, just to throw something on the table for people watching that might be a useful thought is, when I pick up a book, I read a lot of books. There's a mess in the other room of books because I buy more books than I can ever hope to read, but I do my best because I'm fascinated by so many subjects. First place I always go when I look at a book is the blurb on the back. Who is the person who wrote this? Why would I believe anything they write? You have to start there, surely.
Yeah.
You can't start with, I completely take on board everything this person says, by the way, who is it? And are they insane? I think you have to start a bit with, is this source reputable? Why would I listen to it? Yeah. And I think that's one good tip on critical thinking for people to think about is, at least look at the source, at least look at why would you believe this person or not just some site. And then following on from that, asking what might the motivation of the author be and that kind of thing. And also, I think really important for me, Liggy, on critical thinking is being willing to examine both sides of the argument. You've got to be willing to look at a point of view that you don't agree with.
Yes.
Because otherwise you're just reinforcing what you believe all the time, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why I think a life skill right now that is so helpful for all of us is that of curiosity. Because curiosity allows us to ask the question, what else could this mean? We don't need to take everything at face value, and life would be a bit dull if we did that anyway. So being curious and asking questions is a really good way to live your life, because you can learn so much.
Yeah, I agree. Curiosity, absolutely. So should we talk about some of the strategies that you've written about for building resilience and strengthening that skill? I think you had 10 in your book. Would you like, are there particular ones that you would go straight to and say, if you could only do one thing, do this, or are they all equally?
Oh gosh, no, I think they've all got equal merit, for sure.
Start with number one.
Yeah, I'll just sort of pick out a few. I mean, one of the key things is about taking a journey of self-discovery, because when we go through challenging experiences, the great thing about it, no matter what it is, we get to learn a lot about ourselves. So a heightened level of emotional intelligence, being quite self-aware is really key. There's a term that's used quite a lot within the NHS with patients in recovery, and that's the term that's known as self-efficacy. How much do we believe in our ability to get through situations? So understanding yourself, having a good knowledge of, what are my strengths and what are my weaknesses, because we've all got them. For every strength we've got, if we overplay it, that can become a weakness. And having that self-awareness, being able to hold up the metaphorical mirror and have a really good look, really helps.
Yes, because we all have sort of belief systems and filters, don't we, that we view the world through. So some people will be predisposed to see the world in this way, some people more so in that way. And we're all different, but the important thing is to know something about yourself, to be aware that you have those filters, right? Because then you can do some kind of compensation at least, and
Yeah.
and ask, is there another way of looking at this?
Yes. And I think from that point of view as well, it's worth reminding ourselves that we weren't born to be perfect. We were born to be real, and we're not infallible. We all have our fragilities and our vulnerabilities. So it's being real. That's such an important part. You know, it's not creating this facade. We all have bad days. Oh my goodness, we definitely do. You know, we all have good days as well. So it's accepting yourself and seeing yourself as a person in progress. I think this is really key, and that's a big part of resilience, is being real.
Right. Yes. As opposed to trying to defend some kind of persona or mask or
And you know, I see this when people are kind of putting that facade of, oh, look at me, I'm toughing it out and being, you know, really strong here, but actually being authentic and being able to put your hand up and say, do you know what, I'm not all right today, and I could really do with some support. That's what we,
That's such an important point, isn't it, when you think about it? That, and it's paradoxical, isn't it? Because resilience sounds like tough and being able to survive things. But it seems to be a big part of the strength of resilience is being able to say, I'm not okay. This is bothering me. That's resilient, right?
Yeah. But that's because I think sometimes people don't always understand the true definition. They don't really examine it, because, you know, essentially resilience is about recovery. It comes from the Latin term resilia, which means to jump back, which means that we rebound from that negative situation. And, you know, clearly we don't always go back to where we were before, but it is purely about recovery, you know, essentially. Now, true recovery is about acknowledging that journey that you go through. And, you know, sometimes it will be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes we might be struggling. So it's about acknowledging all of the things that we'll go through, not just creating that facade and toughing it out. I like to really emphasize that, because I see people doing that to the detriment of their own well-being, really.
Isn't that where people start to get into things like burnout, because they're just trying to do too much and trying to pretend it's not affecting them?
And burnout is absolutely rife. I mean, you know, pre-pandemic, according to the World Health Organization, stress burnout was the 21st century health epidemic. And I, particularly with the work I'm doing at the moment, I'm seeing more and more people pushing themselves, not taking the time for self-care, not pacing themselves, not listening to the warning signs of stress. Because once you hit that point of burnout, it's not a weekend recovery. You know, for some people, they don't ever recover properly from it.
And of course, it's challenging for people in some situations. I read about this regularly in newspapers, you know, that people in certain organizations are being pushed harder than ever, because, you know, there are fewer people to do more work, because there are many people sick or in isolation or in lockdown or whatever. It seems like fewer and fewer people are being required to work harder and harder, and feeling really under threat in terms of their jobs and their careers, and more reason for the need for this skill.
And you're right, there's a lot of fear about it at the moment. You know, we've got a lot of uncertainty. You know, people have been furloughed, other people are still working, so perhaps they're picking up quite a bit of extra work, and then people who are being furloughed are not, you know, feeling good about that, because they don't like to see their work colleagues being, you know, pushed into this space. So there's a whole cocktail of emotions that people are feeling, and this is why this as a life skill is so important.
So I think what strikes me about all that is a few things. One is that it depends what expectations we have to begin with. So it seems to me the sunscreen, you know, the extent to which we have a bit of a rhino skin and we're not so badly affected by some of these things, starts partly, at least, with what did we expect in the first place. I mean, if you have, you know, unrealistic expectations that life is going to be perfect and wonderful and easy and highly paid. And I think about a lot of people I hear about coming out of university, you know, think maybe not so much these days. I think realism has crept in, but certainly in the last few years, you know, thinking they were going to come out into highly paid careers and life was going to be wonderful. You know, you have to start with some realism, don't you, really? Otherwise, there's a massive disappointment coming down the line, and that's going to be painful.
I think Yeah, I guess there's a danger sometimes that we attach ourselves. We all have that inner control freak, don't we? That we want to kind of shape everything and control everything and plan everything. And life isn't like that. Life isn't perfect. It was never meant to be. And we as human beings are going to experience a whole, rich tapestry of emotions, and that is just part of life. And being able to kind of let go. Sometimes, we attach ourselves to the outcome, want to control it, get disappointed because we've set these expectations. So being able to adapt and be more fluid through some of those situations, to be able to think on our feet, to be able to flex, and to be able to accept changes that we can do nothing about, but think about how we can positively influence those changes is really helpful.
So I think this is really interesting. I hope it's really interesting for people watching. But a lot of what we're talking about here, it seems to me, is not about, which decision to make or which career to pursue or which career move to make. It's more about how we act as people, no matter what, isn't it? Because things are going to come at us, as we're discovering at them right now. Things are going to come at us that we never saw coming.
Yeah.
So the skill, it seems to me, in a lot of this is, like you said, starting with self-awareness, but then realizing that you react in certain ways to certain things, working on the skill of reacting better, taking it less hard, or being less stressed by it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we use the word react, and this is sometimes where we need to look at the word response, because reaction is kind of knee-jerk, autopilot, doing what we've always done. If we want different outcomes, we need to create that space to be able to step back and consider our options. My dad gave me some great advice years ago. He said, if you want to go a bit faster, slow down. And it's such solid advice, because so often we run at things doing what we've always done instead of stepping back and thinking, okay, let's create a bit of space here and let's consider our options. Have you ever read a book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl?
Yeah. It's a must read, everybody.
It's an absolute must read. But he was an Austrian neurologist in the Second World War, in the concentration camps. But I think one of the key things in that book, the big lessons that I took away from it was, you can't necessarily control your environment, but you can absolutely 100% control what goes on within you and your will and how you respond to those situations. And that ultimately is the last of the freedoms that we have. It's liberating, it's empowering to understand nobody can make you feel anything, nobody can make you do something. You have to give that permission. And I think when you hold on to that space within you, knowing that ultimately it's your thoughts, your mindset that helps you to influence that response, that is so empowering. And I think that really supports resilience.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and it really brings home how much of this is internal, really.
Yes.
I think just one concept that's really helpful in all this, I think, is just to think about the fact that when we look at the world, the way we see it is really more about how we are. I love that expression. The way we see the world is more about how we are than the way the world is. Yeah. We're all looking at this differently, and some people say this is fine, there's opportunity here for me, there's commercial opportunity in this. I've been reading about some of those people who've been using the commercial opportunities this morning, but we won't get into that. But that's really important to understand. It's how we're looking out at it. That's where it begins. And once people just understand that concept, then you start to think about, well, hang on a minute, that's interesting. Why am I looking at this so bleakly? What belief system or value system or bit of information from my past is causing me to look at it that way? Yeah. Just a quick anecdote where I really learned this big time. Years ago, I used to work for Samaritans and get calls from people who were very distressed. And it really struck me after a while that I could get 2 calls in the same evening from 2 people with what sounded like almost identical circumstances. One would be suicidal and one would be a bit irritated. And it really struck me, that, hang on, it's how you're looking at it. The extent to which this truly is a disaster is an internal decision. I mean, it's how you filter it and how you colour it, and so we do have the ability to improve on that and to
Definitely. And I think it's kind of taking ownership of the situation. I'll share with you actually something that happened to me, which was a huge education for me personally around resilience. Because even though I'd done, a lot of research, interviewing, but about, oh gosh, nearly 6 years ago, just less than 6 years ago rather, I went to New Zealand to celebrate my parents' 60th wedding anniversary, and I came back and I was absolutely exhausted, and I went to the doctor and I said, I think I've got something wrong with my heart. I can't, explain exactly what it is. Anyway, I went back 3 times and I was adamant there was something wrong, and I went and I had to have a heart scan. And from this heart scan, they actually found a heart tumour. So I actually had a tumour growing inside my heart. It was a very rare condition. And it was just such a shock. I mean, I'm pretty healthy. It was just such a huge shock. And the experience that I went through was such a powerful experience in teaching me about resilience, because one of the key things I learned is I can happen to this situation, or this situation can happen to me, and I'm going to own this situation. And all of the different things that I put together in my strategies, they work. I know firsthand they work. But it was interesting in recovery I had open heart surgery, and in my recovery, just observing the patients in the ward and the people who were going through, similar kind of experiences, just observing from my bed, my hospital bed, the different ways people were responding or reacting into these situations, because some people had gone into, absolute victim patient mode. And some people you could see who were really determined to be part of their recovery and their resilient journey. And just to observe that was fascinating. And to the point you made, it is so much of life. It isn't about what happens to you, it's how you choose to respond to it. And I think that ultimately is the real heart, excuse the pun, but the absolute core of what true resilience is all about, because it's a beautiful subject. It's multifaceted, and very special.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. It's a great example, and just to add to that leads on a little bit to your vitamin G point, doesn't it? About and my point about expectations, because I think when you better explain what vitamin G is.
Yeah, vitamin G. People are going, there isn't a vitamin G. Vitamin G is vitamin gratitude, and vitamin G is about taking time every day to just focus on the things that you're really grateful for. There's some really good scientific evidence that backs up how much better it can make us feel when we do that.
Yeah. And, so that's back to how we look at life, isn't it? If we're grateful for what we have, and I think we talked about this on the radio as well, I always say to people, when they're saying how terrible everything is, I give them a few examples of what it would be like if it was really terrible. Because some people in this world are living in really dire, terrible situations. And it doesn't take too much study to get to the point we think, actually, we're pretty okay. Generally, I know some people are having terrible things happen. But in general, this could be much worse than it is.
Well, absolutely. And I think, sometimes we look at other people's situations and we compare our lives, and what it's like on social media. We see everybody's having this amazing life and ours isn't as good, or, they're having a worse life. But what we need to do is put that into context and think there are many things we can be grateful for, no matter what our circumstances. We're here for a start, and, counting our blessings is really key.
Yeah, and also, if I can throw it in as well, just as a general subject for people to think about, our personal well-being. We talked about self-love and looking after ourselves. But also, when I get a bit grumpy, and I do about lockdown, I do get a bit grumpy sometimes. But as soon as I catch myself doing it, I do something about it. So I'll go for a run. That immediately makes me feel better, because just physically, like you were saying, the chemical effect of some of these things shouldn't be underestimated. So taking care of our bodies, taking care of what we eat, how much we're drinking, if we're drinkers, and whether we're doing good things or bad things to our body, all becomes circular in this, doesn't it?
Yes, Oh gosh, yeah, and never underestimate the basics. Really, it's getting outside in the winter
Mm.
and getting some fresh air and getting some daylight, and as you say, reaching for the healthy coping mechanisms, because our default sometimes can be to reach for the
Right.
unhealthy coping mechanisms, which just compounds the situation.
Right.
And good quality sleep always helps.
So when we talk about self-love, because some people react negatively to that sort of terminology. I think it feels a bit selfish or something like that. But I just think, why wouldn't you treat yourself at least as well as you treat your children? If you wouldn't do this to your children, why are you doing it to yourself? And if you kind of just look after yourself a bit, and it's not unreasonable, is it?
No, not at all. And that whole self-care piece, it's like a bit like, if you don't love yourself, if you don't look after yourself, if you don't respect yourself, why should you expect anyone else to? And
Right.
I'm a big believer that if you fill your pot to overflowing, that's the best effect you can have on other people, because you can, you've got all the energy and the positivity that is going to be quite, useful for other people around you. Depleting yourself and pushing yourself to wreck and ruin, that's not helpful for anyone.
It's not. In fact, it creates problems, doesn't it, in the end? So we're probably coming near to the end of our time, Liggy. I could go on for hours with this, but are there any other sort of key strategies that we haven't talked about that you wanted to mention before we close? Any other things people can think about doing?
I think one of the big suggestions that I would make as well is about visualizing hope and what's on the horizon, because sometimes in the eye of the storm, and let's face it, we probably have got a few challenging months ahead of us. I know we've got great news on the horizon with the vaccine, but there will be a little bit of a journey to take us there. So being able to use visualization and think about the things that you really looking forward to, because when we are a bit down in the dumps or we're just focusing on the negatives, it's really useful for our subconscious mind, because whatever the conscious mind perceives, the subconscious listens to. Being able to create and visualize positive things and create a whole sensory experience around that can be so helpful.
That's really nice, and we can get into a bit of spiritual stuff here. All things will pass. I mean, everything is temporary.
Yeah.
However bad something is, it will end, and feelings of pain end, suffering ends, our lives end in the end. Everything is time limited. So it's important to have perspective, I think, and try and keep everything a bit in perspective, particularly when we're feeling grumpy, when it's tempting to see everything in a fairly extreme way.
Absolutely. This is a moment in time.
Yeah.
There's a lot we can learn from it as well. It's not all bad. There's a lot of negative things, of course, but there's a lot that we can learn. And we can all learn to be a lot more compassionate and empathetic and kind. And that's a really good mix, isn't it?
For sure. That's a wonderful point to end on. Yeah, I'm a great believer in, actually, we all feel more resilient. We all feel happier when we're doing something useful and helpful to other people, I believe. So I'd recommend to anyone to try that as a strategy. So, Liggy, if people wanted to get hold of these things, is there a way they can do it?
Yeah, I've got a website, which is just liggy@liggywebb.com, and there's lots of resources there. I actually just bought out a brand new book, a digital book, and it's free. So if anybody would like to go onto the blog, it's a book of mood boosters. So it's just to lift people up. But there's a digital flip book version on my blog there. So that's just at liggywebb.com.
Liggywebb.com. So start there, get the free download, and take it from there. Liggy, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Oh, you're really, really welcome. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.